World champion in MMA. No opponents left. Nothing to prove. Then one strike of lightning, and he wakes up as a mage in his favorite game. And no one asked him, but he actually played for the night. A powerful family, a magic world. Only one problem. Zero mana. So while everyone else casts spells, he just throws hands. This time he's not bored anymore. And in a world where magic and fencing are at odds, a genius who fights like this shouldn't even exist. 1,000 years ago, there was a war against demons. One day during the war, monsters suddenly crossed the border and attacked humanity. These terrifying creatures fought with the humans. The entire sky shone with magical seals and sparks of light were everywhere. To survive, humans had to fight. The war was endless. The entire earth was covered in blood, and under the onslaught of the monsters, the surviving humans gradually retreated. These monsters had huge mouths with sharp fangs. They attacked the humans, but suddenly a magician appeared. He arrived on the battlefield, riding a black dragon, and began to destroy the monsters. Frightened by such power, they fled. The humans praised their hero, but he died, perished in a pool of his own blood, lying immobilized on the ground. This happened when the war was won. He died an unexpected death. The one who was chosen, the one who was captivated by power, the one who did not succumb to temptation. They await him. Sometime later, some guys in the subway were watching the live broadcast on their phones. The announcer shouted, "Ladies and gentlemen, hello. The main event of the day, the 17th battle for the world title, is about to begin." It was an interesting battle watched by a whole room of spectators. The announcer shouted, "The opponents are here. Patrick occupies the blue corner." All the spectators were unhappy and shouted for him to die. Now the people in the red corner were shouting 37 out of 37 matches won. The world champion with a percentage of knockouts, Jinho. This guy was incredibly muscular and confident. The announcer asked what kind of match today would be. In an interview, Patrick said that in the last fight, Jinho didn't use his legs, but judging by that, he assumes he has some kind of injury. Perhaps Patrick will take advantage of this today. Jinho is already over 40 years old, and if his injury is to his legs, then today a new champion will likely be born before their eyes. The pain is already beginning. The battle between the rivals has begun. Patrick thought fearfully about the incredible fear he was spreading. It was expected of the champion, but if he grabbed his leg, then at that moment, he suddenly decided to attack. The announcer shouted that Patrick was attacking him unexpectedly, and their fight began. He couldn't understand how he dared to go against him with a sore leg. The insolent man. He would make it so he would never be able to take advantage of it. At that moment, Patrick attacked his leg with incredible bloodlust, and a moment later he was knocked down. Jinho struck back with lightning speed, and Patrick fell on his back motionless. The announcer shouted that Patrick couldn't get up. The first round would end in a knockout. Patrick was unable to move, and blood was pouring from his nose. Jinho turned around and asked, "Does he understand? That's why he doesn't use his legs." After a while, Jinho got dressed in the locker room and silently left. His friend asked where he was going. Wasn't he going to give an interview to the reporters? He told them to answer their questions himself. He shouted, he should answer them. He has so many fans. The guy was perplexed and tried to stop the main character. Jinho put his hood up and wished him a good job and to contact him when the next match came up. The guy grabbed his head and replied that he should at least go by car. The weather was terrible. He replied that everything was fine. There were traffic jams now. He'd rather go for a run. But at that moment, the coach was dumbfounded and his eyes widened in surprise. After which, Jinho closed the door behind him. He screamed, "That bastard. His home is 30 kilometers away. How is he going to do this?" At that moment, many reporters held their microphones to him and asked, "Mr. Coach, where is Jinho now? Let him say something about today's match." The coach was angry because he had already run away, and the reporters were asking when he would hold a press conference. Did he deliberately plan the course of his leg injury? The coach sighed, unsure how to respond. Meanwhile, Jinho went outside and thought about how he understood him. He recalled their fight and the announcer shouting at him, "Lightweight division." The fight ended in a knockout. A moment later, Jinho had won and he felt sorry for him. But for the rest of his career, he wouldn't find an opponent he was interested in fighting. Did he really believe those rumors about his leg? Jinho simply decided to limit himself, right? After a while, Juno arrived at a multi-story building and entered the building. He went up to the 34th floor and entered his apartment. There were numerous gift bags outside his apartment, and he was angry because he had already told people not to leave them at his door. After this indignation, he entered his magnificent and spacious apartment. He bathed, washed his hair, threw down the towels, and said, "Well, now he'll begin." At that moment, he happily sat down at the computer desk and started playing. The system announced The Last Savior. The console game The Last Savior is so difficult that even Koreans have stopped playing it. But Jinho had played it absolutely every day for the past 10 years. Because his life was filled with training, hardening, and battles with the strongest opponents, he had long since burned out. He smiled and asked, "Will he fail again today?" At that moment, he realized he could feel the competitive spirit here. There was a demon king in the game, and he was shouting, "Attack him, you bastard." At that moment, bright lightning and thunder roared in the sky. The protagonist lowered his gaze when he was facing his opponent. He didn't understand what was happening. Was he really going to lose like this? His health was already at 0, and at that moment his hero struck his opponent's sword, and he shouted, "No, let him get his strength now." How would he avoid this? He didn't know what to do, and cursed. A multitude of bright beams emanated from the collision between his player and his opponent. At this point, Taurus continued to fight, gritting his teeth in anger before attempting to land another blow on the monster. Joe wondered why he was so predictable today. He'd been hit several more times, and he didn't understand why his attacks were so good. He frowned and looked ahead. A huge magical beast appeared before his face, roaring and opening its mouth. Torres confidently attacked the creature with his sword. It was ironic. He'd started the fight with the desire to win, yet he was afraid of victory. Let him gain strength. The Demon King, he can do it. He supported with words and attacked flawlessly with his hands. And finally, Torres attacked the Demon King. The system congratulated him for defeating the Demon King, the last savior. "Thank you for playing the game." Gino frowned and realized he had already become a champion in 2 worlds. A moment later, he smashed the computer mouse against the monitor, smashing it while muttering, "Who am I supposed to fight now?" Maybe he could do it against the brown bear and get out. He cursed, but he had nothing to say. Meanwhile, a bright bolt of lightning lit up the entire sky, and he looked out the window and was surprised. These bright sparks struck his house and window. After some time, he woke up and realized that his head was spinning and his body was burning. Suddenly, he felt rain on himself and asked when did he manage to get outside. He was stepping in puddles, and someone was shouting at him to wake up so they could come together. At that moment, someone grabbed him by the shoulder and shouted 218. He turned around, and the guy said that he'd been calling him forever, and what was he doing here? Now, he didn't have time to just stand there. They needed to leave any minute. He asked again, "Who is he?" And suddenly, he saw the number on his jacket. 172. His mouth dropped open in shock, and he asked again, "But where is it?" At that moment, many of the same people in orange jackets ran toward the gate. The rain continued to pour, and Jinho couldn't understand. He'd seen the symbol somewhere before. He saw a flag fluttering in the strong wind. Ryu came right up to him and shouted at him to get ready. Did he really want to rot here forever? Perhaps today was their last chance to escape this damned carry-on. He looked at him in surprise and asked, what could this place really be a carry-on? He was dumbfounded by what he heard and couldn't move for a while. When he realized what this place was, he started to fall to the ground, but Ryu grabbed him and shouted at him to hurry up and not waste time. He didn't know what to say. Could this all be a dream? Many people grabbed the gates with ropes and began to pull. They were getting the hang of it. Almost there. Gino continued to think, no, this wasn't like a dream at all. So, he really was inside the game he was playing, and a prisoner at that. Ryu grabbed his hand and pulled him along, shouting that they needed to run faster. It was all doubtful, of course, but first, he needed to get out of here. Suddenly, he told them to stop and clench his fist. Ryu turned around and screamed, "Have you completely lost your mind? Now, is not the time to do this?" He asked again, "But isn't that weird? Such a thing simply can't happen in this city. It's all too simple." He shouted that it was all because General Clark wasn't here right now. He asked again, "General?" Ryu replied, "Yes, he just left, so they had a chance. Let him get ready and run faster." At that moment, the protagonist grabbed him by the hood and dragged him in the opposite direction. Ryu screamed, "What is he doing?" He was completely out of his mind. He knew that if it was true, he understood the situation somewhat, but his champion's instincts told him that he absolutely mustn't go beyond these gates. Ryu screamed at him to let him go and called him a scumbag. That moment, the doors opened, and now they were free. People ran out at breakneck speed, one after another, running at incredible speed. Ryu screamed at him to let go. No, he had to get out of here, too. The guys were rejoicing at having managed to escape, when suddenly, everyone froze, and one by one was destroyed. Someone pounced on them and began attacking, chopping off their arms and legs. It was General Clark laughing and shouting that these worthless people should die, and shouted at his soldiers to kill them all right now. At that moment, Ryu asked in confusion, "General Clark, why was he acting like this?" Gino replied, didn't he understand? This was a trap, and he should shut up and run away from here. At that moment, many prisoners were killed, and some of them began to run back, crying in fear. After some time, the walls of the fortress were covered in the prisoners' blood. The rain continued unabated, and General Clark, walking around the slain people, ordered the remaining men to line up the prisoners. They shouted, "Yes, General. Let them all stand up straight and don't move." Among these prisoners were Jinho and Ryu, who obeyed and looked at the floor. Ryu was completely confused as to what was happening and looked at the dead acquaintances scattered across the field. He began to vomit from fear and horror, and he vomited into his hands. Jinho watched in bewilderment when suddenly a general approached Ryu and shouted that he had told him not to move. He grabbed him by the hair and began shaking him from side to side. Then he shouted that anyone who dared move would be slaughtered immediately. He was crying, and Jinho realized that even young people were shown no mercy. It seemed as if a new massacre could begin at any moment, so he really would have to fight. At that moment, Clark approached Jinho and told him he was lucky, or maybe he hadn't had the courage to run. He realized that General Clark stood before him, declaring that all mages were cowards and that it was shameful to be their opponent. He would regret not dying today. With these words, he approached his face and, grinning, called him Arahan. Let him wait. Jinho looked at his reflection through a puddle and, perplexed, realized that his name was Arahan. A week passed in the labor camp. There's only one daily task here: assembling stone towers. It's a useless chore to force the prisoners to work. After a week in this body, he realized something. He looked at his hands and realized firstly that this body was extremely weak. His hands were shaking. Just lifting a single stone made his breathing ragged. He was about 15 years old. Secondly, he tried using magic at night when no one was looking, but it hadn't worked. It's strange that Arhan can't use magic. After all, the Arhan family is the strongest mage family. Why can't he use it? Or maybe that's why they threw him here. This sounds like something the Arhan family might have done. At that moment, the general turned to him and shouted, "Okay, now he has to move the tower the other way." Why was he fidgeting like that? He should move faster. Jinho grabbed a stone and understood. And yet, the system reported synchronization. Due to the large amount of data, synchronization is delayed. His progress is 78%. He wondered when this would all end. After some time, he arrived at the dining room and took a plate of food and bread. Since coming here, he had started exercising regularly, but the only food here was this. Ryu approached him and said, 218. Won't he want bread again today? He was surprised and said that he had come and said, "No, let him take this." Ryu was very happy, and the protagonist realized that everyone else was avoiding him, but he was special. He began to eat his bread with joy. Archons are the most powerful mages, and rumors circulate about their red eyes. They are a curse for how many people they have destroyed, and that anyone who looks into them will die. They are about the same age and live in the same room. He has no memories of what happened before he ended up in this body, but it seems they are friends. However, how could someone so young end up in a carry-on? Ryu said for sure he should be more careful. He asked again, "Why is that?" He replied that because of him, their workload had been increased, something the other prisoners weren't too happy about. Maybe he should relax. Why was he fussing so hard with those rocks? He realized that this explained all the murderous looks he'd been getting lately. Ryu had told him to be especially wary of number 589. He knew him, right? He was the leader of the prisoners. He was also known in the arena, and they said he was here for murder. Jinho asked again, then wasn't it dangerous for him to go with him? He smiled and replied that he didn't care since it was obvious they knew each other. He asked again, so what he might get in his way, so let him go somewhere. At that moment, he stood up, and Ryu asked in surprise why he had suddenly started acting like that. He heard approaching footsteps and said what he was worried about is about to happen. Ryu turned questioningly to the side and saw the leader of the prisoners approaching. One of them was number 589, the leader. He approached Jinho and said, "They say they've been given extra work because of him." He asked, let's say he wanted to exercise, but before he could finish, his opponent punched him in the face. Jinho fell unconscious, and Ryu started screaming. 218 at that moment, Jinho grabbed him by the neck and smiled, looking him in the eyes. A moment later, he climbed onto his body and began attacking. Ryu was stunned with fear and didn't know what to do. The surrounding guys, the leader's subordinates, also gaped in shock and shouted, "Leader!" At that moment, the protagonist relaxed, and the leader asked with a smile, "What is he doing?" Jinho wondered if he hadn't felt anything at all, just how weak was this body. The leader grabbed him by the collar with just one hand and lifted him above himself, then swung and slammed him into the wall with incredible force. Ryu screamed in fear. 218, the leader looked at the wall in bewilderment and asked, "Where is he going, little rat?" Today would be his end. Jinho lowered his gaze and couldn't move. He was in incredible pain when suddenly the system reported a notification. 100% synchronization progress. Synchronization was complete, and he smiled as he looked at his opponent. Suddenly, magical beams of mana appeared around his body and continued to spread throughout the room. He clenched his fist pushed off the ground and deliberately glared at his opponent with a terrifying expression. He pulled out his fingers, then took a special stance, and clenching his hands in a fist told the leader to come closer. He laughed loudly, and coming closer said that he had even been kicked out of his family. Who does he think he is now? He told him to stop talking nonsense and come here. Or was he chicken-eating out? The leader shouted that he was now fulfilling his wish. With these words, he rushed to attack. But at that moment, the protagonist pulled out his leg and kicked his opponent. Unfortunately, he was unable to do so, as the leader grabbed his leg with his hand and said that rats need to know their place. At that moment, the protagonist kicked him in the neck with his other foot, and he was dumbfounded by the pain. He grabbed his neck and pulled back, then exclaimed, "What?" Jinho delivered another kick to his face, causing the leader's blood to spill, and he began to fall to the ground. Jinho continued to destroy his opponent with one blow after another. And after a moment, the leader finally fell to the ground and did not move. Smoke emanated from his powerful blows, and Jinho muttered that he hadn't planned on using his legs. At that moment, the leader's subordinates shouted, "Why are they standing there? They must kill him now." All the guys rushed to the attack, shouting to make his death painful. At that moment, Jinho calmly pushed himself away from the leader's body and told everyone to stop. The guys were dumbfounded by what they saw, and Jinho grabbed the leader's hand and said that if they moved, they would have to spoon-feed him for the rest of his life. It would be better if they brought the warden here. At that moment, they were stunned and unsure what to do. Staring silently at Jinho, he asked again, did they really think he was joking? If they didn't believe him, then maybe he should rip off one of his arms. One of the guys shouted that he understood everything and would bring him now. Meanwhile, the leader was shouting at him that he was a bastard and that he wouldn't spare him next time. Jinho wondered if those words had even slipped out of his mouth. At that moment, Ryu ran up to him. He was stunned and amazed by his actions and asked where he learned to do that. He thought it was very cool, but had he always been that tall? He thought they were about the same height. He replied that it was from carrying stones and that he advised him to do the same. Ryu asked again which stones were related to height. Synchronization had indeed transferred his stats from reality here, but only here he had the body of a child. No, the most important thing now was his actual stats. The system reported that his name was Zed Oron, class mage with traits including steadfastness, a victor in hopeless situations, a natural-born warrior, the soul of a champion, and the blessing of great S-rank mages. Stats. Penalties for underdevelopment have been applied. Strength, dexterity, endurance, and perception were 100, but are now 50. Magic is 0. He was dying to see this. At that moment, he saw that his magic was 0 and asked, could this be a mistake? Magic could be 0, but he's a mage. How could he have 0 magic? Why did he possess such a loser? He continued to stare at the number 0 in bewilderment and laughed at the system. Ryu, who couldn't see the system in front of him, didn't understand what he was doing. After some time, the protagonist found himself in his prison. And as he lay down on his bed, he thought, such bad characters really exist. That's probably why they kicked him out of his family. The Archon could have done this. They have neither blood nor tears. He first needed to calm down and slowly check everything out. But he's at least grateful for the fact that all his other stats are 100. He doesn't care that he has penalties. In such a crappy body, he wouldn't be able to maximize them. He's also young. He thinks the penalties can be worked off with hardening, but food will still be scarce, and he's never seen such traits before, and they're all high-ranking. He's only familiar with steadfastness. He's a winner in hopeless situations. He's earned them himself while playing. If his magic weren't at 0, he'd think this was a cheating character. The blessing of great mages is S. This is nonsense, but the rest could be learned gradually. He'll figure something out with magic, too. With these thoughts, he got out of bed and suddenly heard a scream. The numbers that were about to be called should come out. He looked questioningly at the door, and Ryu realized they were back. They started calling. 114, 456, 891, 2918 should come out. All the guys came out of their cells and followed each other. Jinho asked who these people were. Ryu replied that they were sentenced to death. They were probably called for their last meal. He asked again, last meal? Ryu answered, yes. This is when before death they are allowed to eat whatever they want. He was surprised and realized that's what it is. So what's his name? Ryu was surprised and asked again his they only called each other by numbers. After that he gave his name and said that he was from a poor family, so he didn't have a last name. And what's his name? He replied that his name was Zed Eraon. He addressed Ryu by name and asked, does he want to get out of here? He asked again what? But if he was talking about that, then he doesn't plan on staying here for long. He has a reason to leave. He asked again, right? And was he thinking about how to escape? He replied that the only way out of here is through the gate, and the general has the key. He asked again, was he going to kill him and take the keys? Ryu asked again, was he right in the head? He might be retired, but he was a knight of the fifth circle. General Clark was a classic knight filled with hatred for mages. In the world of the last savior, knights and mages hated each other. He understood that the knight of the fifth circle was retired. Would the current him be able to defeat him? Go said there had to be another way, and he replied that they could simply steal. He asked again what? Ryu asked a question, and he didn't know. Children of the lower classes put their hands in other people's pockets more often than they say hello. But there were always a lot of eyes on the general, so there weren't many options. He grinned and looked sadly at the floor, then smiled and replied, "That's right." He was gradually beginning to understand how to escape from here. After some time, a new workday began. The sun shone brightly, and all the prisoners went outside. The general announced that from that day on, he had decided to increase the workload again, so they would be running instead of walking. At that moment, all the prisoners were dumbfounded by what he had heard and asked again, "What? Let him be human. How much longer can he bully them? Let him at least give them achievable tasks." Clark's subordinate shouted, "Are they disobeying the general's orders now?" The prisoners exclaimed in response that it was truly difficult. But suddenly, one of them saw the blade that was already near his neck. And the knight said he was only relaying the general's words. If he had any complaints, he should bring them to him. The young man asked again, "What's wrong? Isn't that too much? What's the reason?" The worker asked again, "Why did they still not understand who caused this?" At that moment, Gino approached them, and everyone looked at him with hatred. The man cleared his throat and said he thought he was going out for a smoke. The guys wanted to attack him, and Ryu turned to him and said the atmosphere was bad. He asked him to step back and realized, damn, Clark, he's provoking conflict, but he can't do it himself. So, he's hoping the criminals will kill him like yesterday. But how could a glorious knight be capable of such meanness? Ryu stepped back and turned around in fear. He thought about how the warden was on his side this time, and it wouldn't be as easy as yesterday. He couldn't die. The prisoners approached him and said they had to kill him, otherwise they would die themselves. Jinho noted that they had understood correctly and there was nothing they could do about it. They grew angry and shouted, "The blood of a mage is still alive in him to the last. Is he going to bluff? Let him die right now." At that moment, all the prisoners rushed at him, shouting that he was a scumbag. The protagonist repelled their attacks, and the prisoner's blood was spilled. He destroyed one enemy after another while fighting with his feet. One of them flew aside, and he muttered, "He can't just stand there and wait for them to kill him, can he?" The prisoners shouted that he was crazy. Juno replied that he needed to let off some steam anyway. They looked at their attack friend and shouted, "Has he really lost his mind? They should finish him off right now." Jinho clenched his fists and smiled, shouting, "Get everyone here." He was ready to attack. At that moment, all the prisoners, their expressions ominous, rushed at him, but he immediately attacked the first ones who appeared in his path. With these words, he said that they had made a stupid mistake. Scum. One of the prisoners grabbed his friend Ryu and grinned, saying that all he could do was talk. He screamed in fear and could not escape from the hands of his opponent. The prisoner pulled out a knife and said he should consider it an honor to stand against him. He was a second circle knight, and he was Arahan, and he didn't have magic. All he could do was die. At that moment, he lunged with the knife at the protagonist, who looked confidently ahead and suddenly vanished. The guy was stunned, confused as to what was happening or where he had run off to, when suddenly he looked in shock at how Jinho saved his friend and destroyed the guy who grabbed him. The prisoner asked in surprise, "What did he just do? He couldn't use magic, could he?" He hinted and replied that it wasn't magic, then abruptly kicked off the ground, spun around in midair, and attacked the prisoner, kicking him. He too fell to the ground and was destroyed. At that moment, the general arrived, called for number 218, and told him to explain himself. At that moment, he decided to stand up for him and shouted at him to stop, saying he was the victim. He'd been taken hostage and was about to be beaten. It was self-defense. Clark frowned and, looking at the prisoners, realized they were idiots. Then asked a question. Jinho looked at him carefully, and the general asked, "Did he have mana?" He replied that he knew nothing, and at that moment a bright purple flame appeared from behind the general. All the prisoners began to rise from the ground, and he ordered them to breathe. Ryu fell to the ground, unable to move. The protagonist realized he wasn't taking damage from the general's energy, but it was impossible to resist the power of the fifth circle. He stood motionless, looking at the general in surprise and asking what's wrong. The system reported that he had a special ability, the Champion Soul S, which resists suppression. This was the same ability he hadn't seen before. Resistance. Could this really be a feature that grants them immunity? He smiled and realized it was truly imbalanced, after which he rejoiced and realized that in the real world his body had reached its peak, and it would be a shame to waste it on some knight. This game knows something. The general was dumbfounded when he saw that he couldn't suppress Jinho and wondered if he could really stand there calmly. He was just some idiot who didn't even have mana. This thought angered him greatly, and he exhaled heavily and added even more mana, causing the ground beneath his feet to crumble into tiny pieces. All the prisoners were pinned to the ground and unable to move. But the system again informed Jinho that his feature resisted suppression. So he easily handled such pressure and stood confidently on his feet. This was even more than just an S rank. What do you do now? Clark was dumbfounded by what he saw, and his mouth fell open in amazement, not understanding how this was possible. His subordinates turned to him in trembling voices and asked him to stop as they were already feeling unwell. The energy was affecting them as well. The general stopped adding energy and silently looked at Jinho. Jinho chuckled at the fact that he had finally finished, and he had already thought he would pick up his sword and swing it. The general looked him intently in the eyes, then abruptly turned and shouted at his subordinates to get back to work. At that moment, Jinho turned to him and told him to stop as he had something to say. Clark turned and asked, "What?" Jinho said he was tired of building these towers and tired of thinking about the next time he would be attacked. Ryu, fearing for his life, turned questioningly at him, but Jinho approached the general and asked him to let him die. Ryu asked, "What does that mean?" He continued to say that, as he said, he wanted to be sentenced to death. At that moment, the general was dumbfounded and asked, "Do you even understand what his words mean? If this was just a momentary whim, then he wouldn't spare him." Jinho asked again, was he afraid he was a coward? Maybe they'd record it in the crystal ball. The general grinned and replied that there was no better proof. At that moment, he turned and shouted to the guards to bring the crystal ball quickly. Jinho realized he was overjoyed and said that people say before death, a person is allowed to have whatever they want. He wanted to decide on the menu right now. For his last meal, he wanted special beef. So much so that his belly would burst. The guards started shouting, "What? Such special beef?" He was crazy. After all, a death row inmate can't be relied upon for so many servings. Verdi-Sun beef is the meat of cows raised in the Southern Empire on the free meadows of Verdi, the highest quality. In The Last Savior, it is one of the most precious foods. Its taste imparts an unknown power. The description says that eating it will allow you to win a battle. And there was even a quest where you had to bribe an NPC with it. He had to eat it before his important fight, and he'd always wanted to try this beef. He asked, "So, isn't this a fitting price for his life?" Since he didn't consider him high-ranking, he didn't agree to it. If he decided to cheat him, the contract would be canceled. At that moment, Ryu asked 218 the death penalty. He realized that he had not warned him and said that he was also going with him. They both had to eat their fill. Ryu exclaimed, "What, him too?" The general replied that they would. And all the guards were dumbfounded by what they saw. He said that since they were taking the mage's life, that's how it would be. He understood everything perfectly. Ryu asked again, frightened, "Wait, what about his opinion?" People say beef is so expensive that it takes weeks to harvest a single piece. During this time, he doesn't have to work. He's fed the guards food, and he can devote all his time to exercise. Ryu watched his actions and said they were about to be killed, and he didn't understand why he was training. The Last Savior has a special system. When one stat exceeds the table, the accumulated points begin to transfer to the next, and all his stats except magic are already at maximum. This means his experience points will now be completely transferred to magic. After some time, the guard approached him and said, 11,172,218 must leave. He was glad that they had finally come to him. Ryu clutched his head and said that these were nightmares. This is where his life would end. When they arrived in the room where the beef was on the table, it looked incredibly delicious and appetizing. Ryu ate with admiration in his eyes, saying that for the first time in his life, he had eaten something so delicious. Jinho replied not to forget that this is all thanks to him. At that moment, he wondered what was going on with his skills, and the system reported that the penalty had been partially mitigated several times. He realized that all his experience points seemed to be acre-wing simultaneously. The first goal had been achieved, and now they needed to move on to the next. At that moment, the overseer approached the general and announced that the last meal had begun. Clark asked them to make sure no one interfered. He didn't understand what kind of strange day this was. His face was expressionless. It was as if everything had passed him by, and although he was retired, he was still a knight of the fifth circle. It can't be that some young mage without mana could withstand his power. He must have made a mistake then, but this time he would do everything appropriately. He looked at the shining bracelet on his wrist and realized that it would return the stress he had experienced many times over. A moment later, they had all eaten and the plates were empty. Ryu breathed a sigh of relief and said he didn't mind dying now. He replied that now wasn't the time to die. Jinho realized he was full of energy, and it felt like he could punch a punching bag for days and wanted to test that power as soon as possible. At that moment, the door to the room opened and Jinho turned around and asked, "He's here. How could this be? They've already eaten everything." The general looked at them and said, 218, no Zed. And Jinho asked again, what was he offended that they didn't leave him anything? Jinho stared confidently ahead, and Clark thought he was being impudent, believing only in his bloodline. He looked at his magic bracelet and realized that he would first make that face contort into a grimace of pain. He grabbed his shoulder, deciding that now his bracelet would work. The Arahan are the most elite family of mages. Even the slightest bit of information could play into his hands, because with it he could escape this hole. At that moment, Clark's bracelet glowed brightly, and the protagonist realized what it was. He touched the bracelet to his shoulder, and Jinho realized it was a magical artifact. Everything around him glowed with bright magical calves, and Clark screamed just like that. Even he did this time, but before he could finish his sentence, he suddenly realized nothing had happened to Jinho. The protagonist merely smirked at his opponent and looked confidently into his eyes. Ryu, who was standing next to him, began to plummet to the floor, and Clark was confused. He yelled that Jinho was a scumbag and threw Ryu aside, causing him to fall head first onto the ground and start screaming. Jinho turned to the general and asked him to behave appropriately. He called him a damned freak and grabbed him by both shoulders, trying to hurt him somehow, but it was no use. Jinho just smirked at him and, removing his hand, asked, "He told you to behave properly." The general was dumbfounded by what he saw, and Jinho continued to say that if he wanted to kill him, he should do it properly, not show off. Clark was stunned with surprise, his mouth hanging open in amazement. He realized he'd even used the artifact, but nothing had happened. Magic had no effect on him. But for that to happen, he'd have to be a level higher, so he's a level 6. But that simply couldn't be true. He was speechless. Wait, then it must be the Ahan bloodline. He looked into his eyes where his stunned reflection was visible. It had taken him his entire life to reach the 5th level, and even then he couldn't bring this petty mage to his knees. His bracelet suddenly stopped glowing, and Jinho asked, "Is he finished yet?" The general lowered his gaze, and after a moment of silence announced that the execution would take place the following morning. He might be Arahan, but he couldn't go against imperial law. He turned and headed for the exit, wishing him a good night. Some time later, a candle lit in the general's office. He sat and wrote a book with a quill, thinking that he didn't yet fully understand everything, but perhaps it would be useful information for the knights. So, he picked up the quill and began writing. He felt he needed to record everything that had happened today, and he continued to scribble with concentration. He was tired, had exhausted all his mana, and had used up the artifact, but he needed to finish the report. Suddenly, his strength gave out, and he dropped the quill. Meanwhile, a bright light appeared in the dungeon. Ryu pursed his lips in fear, and when Jinho approached him, he asked, "Is he up?" How did he feel? He was shaking with fear, and in a trembling voice said that it was disgusting and that he felt like he was going to vomit. He mentioned that he had dexterous hands, and he chuckled at that. Afterward, he showed him the keys in his pocket and asked, "Have you seen them? How do you like his skills?" He replied that he was doing well. For an ordinary person, it would be dangerous, but he was simply a master. Ryu replied that it was all because the general was focused on him. Did he really not care? He chuckled and said he was fine. Ryu replied that it was strange because there were definitely things he didn't know about him. He replied that it was all just carrying rocks. At that moment, Jinho thought he was right. His special abilities included several S-class skills. His stats had increased by 10, which was an excellent result. The rumors were true, and the meat was tasty and nutritious. Granted, he had trained a little. He looked at his hands and felt real changes. It was a very pleasant sensation. He also wanted to get rid of all the penalties as soon as possible, but it wouldn't be easy. He clenched his fist and realized that this was just perfect. After which, turning to Ryu, he said that they needed to get out tonight and let her rest for now, and then they would leave. He asked again, weren't they leaving right now? The general would notice the loss of the keys, wouldn't he? Jinho asked him not to worry about it, as he was sure he was already asleep. Ryu asked again, how did he know about that? Jay remembered he was wearing a bracelet, and he too couldn't remember the exact name of his trinket, but it was an item that instantly released mana and absorbed all power. So now he was definitely asleep. Having brought the keys to dinner made his plan doubly simple. When night fell, they decided to quietly leave. Ryu approached the door and asked if everything would definitely be okay. He said that if he was scared, he could stay here. He screamed, what? He was his last hope, and they needed to be together. But there's no key to this door. What will they do? Jay asked him to step aside, and he turned questioningly at him. After which Joe kicked the door open with an incredible crash. He screamed in surprise. What kind of power was this? Was he really a mage? Someone noticed the noise. It was the security guards who ran out and shouted, What's going on? Room 218. What's he doing there? Jinho turned around and asked again, what else? The guards realized it was an escape and shouted to report it to the general quickly and seize him. The guys ran outside, and Ryu shouted that there was something out front. He was dumbfounded and realized the gates were blocked, and there was already a crowd of armed guards there. Jino didn't slow down, and one of the guards said to stop them at all costs. Everyone understood his order, and Jinho ordered Ryu not to stop and to keep running. After these words, he sped up, and Ryu responded in surprise. Okay. Before watching in amazement, Jino was able to get past the first opponent thanks to his incredible agility. He struck the man in the face with his palm, sending him flying. He did it with such speed that everyone else was stunned and surprised, and they began to fall one after another. When several guards were struck, one of them became frightened and realized the dire situation they were all in. At that moment, Jino decided to pounce on him too, striking him in the neck. The man cried out in horrific pain, and a bloody ball appeared on his neck. Jino moved past guard after guard, approaching the main ones who were already cowering in fear, some of them lowering their swords. Jino pounced on the remaining opponents, destroying them with his feet, and they continued to shout that he must be killed. Everyone attacked him from different sides, but Jinho was so agile that he was able to defeat each of the attacking opponents. He kicked the guards in the face and landed ready for another push. After a moment, he finally stopped and turned around to see two more guards attacking, causing him to grin and hit them with a single kick. Ryu, who saw what was happening, was dumbfounded and remarked that such astonishment would drive one crazy. The general, who later saw the destroyed guards, watched silently in bewilderment. They tried to rise from their seats and apologize to him, but the general only looked toward the open gate. When he was told that this was number 218, he froze with irritation and shouted for everyone to grab him and bring him back. Sometime later, the guys arrived in the village of Moda near the colony. Once there, they hid in a barrel in a chest located outside. The main character stood up and said that he thought they had managed to break away. He breathed a sigh of relief, and turning around, they looked around. Jinho asked Ryu where they were, replied that they were in the village of Moat. There was nothing else around the colony. He assumed that meant they'd come here first. He asked again what could he do. The other towns were very far away, but if they blended in with the crowd, everything would be fine. The protagonist decided to believe him and then asked what he was doing. He handed him some strange clothes from the trash and said they were just right. Let him wear them. Jinho asked again why he'd chosen the most homeless clothes. He replied that there were plenty of poor people here and it was easiest to blend in. He would go collect the bare necessities and Jino should wait here and keep a low profile. He'd explained everything, but they didn't have any money, did they? Ryu asked, who needs money? He understood that he really was different from the others. Ryu said he'd be back soon, so he shouldn't go anywhere because he was his last hope. He silently looked into his eyes and understood his last hope. An hour later, Ryu arrived and Jinho asked again what he brought. He said they were colored contacts. When Jinho put them on, his eyes turned blue and he asked, how do you like them? Ryu replied that it wasn't bad. Red eyes betray a mage, so he should be careful. This was the land of the Bahals, so blue contacts were popular. For aristocrats, eye color is just another accessory. The Bajal family was familiar to him because his character was a Bajal, the one with whom he'd fought to the very end. The clan of mages is the Arahan, and the clan of knights is the Bahan. Even the eye colors of the wearing clans are opposites. Thanks for taking care of him, Ryu replied. You're welcome. He found a spot on the way here and offers to rest there. After a while, they found themselves in a small house in the forest. There, they lay down to sleep on some hay, and Jinho couldn't fall asleep. He stared at the floor and wondered how it had happened that he was here, also as a prisoner. He opened his eyes and suddenly found himself in a game. And now he even had to hide in the stable. Well, at least it was fun here. But why did Ryu follow him everywhere? He called him his last hope, knowing he would always be in danger since Clark was hunting him. He didn't know anything about him yet. He was a street thief, and now he was with him because he needed help. It turned out that Ryu hadn't slept either. Jinho wondered if he could trust him. The next day, the sun rose brightly. When the guys woke up, the protagonist realized what he hadn't seen in the darkness yesterday. Had he really slept this? There were flatbreads under his body. When Ryu woke up, he stretched and said, such an elite aristocrat probably doesn't feel very comfortable. He asked again, who likes that? He replied, that people learn to live within their means. Gino replied that that wouldn't do. He needed to earn money, and they needed to live somewhere. Ryu asked again, how would they do that? They couldn't be seen by the guards, could they? Maybe you should teach him how to steal. And Gino replied, no, it's better for him to find a place. Ryu, surprised, asked again, what did he mean? What place? Gino replied, the ring. Underground fights take place in the ring. Heavyweights fight there. A serious struggle ensued, and Jinho and Ryu entered this dungeon, looking around in surprise. A crowd of fans screamed with joy when they saw the fight. Ryu whispered that he thought they'd come to the wrong place. Jinho replied, "No, this was exactly the place they needed." At that moment, one of the fighting men bit his opponent's arm, but immediately received a heavy blow to the cheek. The rivals were engaged in a serious struggle when suddenly one of them was attacked. People shouted at him to fight with all his might. After all, someone had bet everything on him. Let him kill him. Gino expected it to be a regular street fight, but even more intense. Ryu didn't understand why they were there and said it was scary, so he suggested they fly away. At that moment, one of the rivals lunged at the other and punched him in the face, drawing blood and sending the man falling to the ground. His opponent continued to punch him, and Ryu couldn't understand. Had Jinho seen it? Didn't people kill each other here? This was no match for any carry-on prisoner. He didn't think he could defeat him with his hold, did he? When he turned around, he saw that Jinho was no longer nearby. And suddenly, everyone around was stunned by what they saw. Blood continued to flow from Ika's hand, and Jinho approached him, removed his hand, and asked, "Can't he see that his opponent is already unconscious?" He wasn't fighting according to the rules. Ika turned around in surprise, and at that moment, Ryu twisted his face in confusion. He didn't understand what this idiot was doing there. Jinho turned to the referee and asked, "Have they paid him or something?" The winner had already been decided. So why didn't he stop the fight? Or are there no rules here? At that moment, I turned his hand away and shouted, "Who is he?" If he's an aristocrat, he's even more infuriating. Gino asked, "Is he him? But can't you see?" At that moment, all the spectators fell silent, stunned, and quietly watched what was happening. He asked again, "Can't you see that he's a homeless person?" He smiled, and people started shouting, "What? This was just a poor guy. How dare he interrupt the game?" It only made them more curious. "Let him give him his money back," Gino replied, "so he would take responsibility for it. Would they like it if he fought the Ikas? Let them wait, because he would show them something interesting." Joe smiled, and Ryu shouted his name in fear. He had told him they didn't belong here. The Ikas were 100 times stronger than all the prisoners. His chance was 1 in 100, or even 1 in 1,000. Did he even understand what he was getting himself into? He wouldn't be able to defeat him. Did he understand that he was absolutely no match for him? Let him choose another opponent. Ryu screamed so loudly in fear that Jinho had to cover his ears. He asked him to be quiet and instead go and bet everything on him. Ryu asked again, stunned. Was he even listening to him, or was he going to continue making unjustified moves? Let him get better, and then they'll get out of here. At that moment, Jinho addressed him by name and offered to eat some beef when he finished and fill their bellies. Ryu asked not to be bribed, and a moment later, the fight began. Jinho found himself facing a serious opponent who was extremely angry. He kept saying that this homeless person had completely lost his mind from poverty. Then he noticed something strange and asked what's going on. How unusual. He looks about 15 years old, but what's with that look in his eyes? He also breathes calmly, and his stance is definitely different from the others. It's threatening, but at the same time, very calm. Magical energy formed around Jinho, and he felt uneasy, not understanding what was happening. Was he really afraid of some homeless person? He was Ika's after all. At that moment, he became enraged and rushed at Jinho with incredible speed. But a moment later, he realized he'd easily dodged his opponent's punch and had been hit in the nose, drawing blood. Gino asked him not to put his fist behind his shoulders. The punch should be delivered from a defensive stance directly into the opponent's face. It's the fastest way, and it's easy to hit. It's also very fast. He struck his opponent and understood that sometimes you can shift your center of gravity to hit even harder. Jinho struck his opponent right in the jaw, and he lost several teeth and suffered numerous bruises. People started screaming. Who is he, or is giving in to him? Jinho thought, War, God of luck, God of miracles, Band of life. Please let him come back alive. People started screaming. Why is he giving in? He should keep his eyes open. Ryu opened his eyes and realized what was happening in the ring. People started shouting that this poor guy was beating him. And Jinho was confident and smiling. Ryu was frightened and wide-eyed asked, what? Was he really winning? How is this possible? Ika's frowned with anger, not understanding what was happening. Was he really losing to such a brat? He gritted his teeth in anger and pounced again, but Jinho easily dodged and hit him in the stomach, and I couldn't understand why he couldn't dodge his small fists. A moment later, he received several more blows and screamed. There are no words. He needs to pull himself together. Gino hit him again in the head, and a moment later, he fell to the ground, motionless and unconscious. At that moment, Gino turned to the referee and said, let him look here. What is he doing? Or should he also play without rules? The referee looked away in bewilderment and shouted that the fight was over. The duelist had won. Jinho realized that it was over before it had even begun and that he should put in less effort. After a while, he found himself next to Ryu, who asked, "Is he kidding? The odds were 62 to 1. Why did he have so little gold? Were they trying to cheat him because he was young? Surely, this couldn't be explained by simple math." The worker replied that this was absolutely not true. They had definitely given him everything. Gino didn't understand. There couldn't be so little money here. At that moment, he turned to Ryu and asked how many coins he had bet. Ryu turned away, bewildered, and didn't answer. Gino repeated that he had already told him to bet everything. Ryu said he hated betting. He needed to save money for dinner. The employee didn't want them to argue here. And at that moment, an unknown girl approached them, surrounded by 2 large security guards, and greeted him. She grinned and asked, "Do you have time to talk a little?" The protagonist turned around and realized the judge was looking at her. He asked, "Who is she?" The girl smiled and replied that judging by his first visit, he didn't know her. She was the owner of this ring, and her name was Herna. She approached and asked if she could meet him, but Jinho passed her and said he wasn't for sale. Ryu turned and realized it was that same Herna. They couldn't leave quietly as 2 of Herna's guards were waiting for them. Jinho looked up and asked, "Do they want to get something from him too? How many days did they want to sleep?" The guards looked at him in bewilderment, and Jinho realized they weren't even blinking. Were they really that devoted to that woman? Herna replied that she had found the game's champion he had beaten today in the big city. Did he understand what that meant? She would let him go today, but they would still meet again. Next time, they would talk in a more pleasant setting because she really loved strong people. Jinho frowned, looked at her silently, and said nothing. After a while, the guys went into a cafe to grab a bite to eat. They sat down at a table and waited for the meat. Ryu rested his head on the table and muttered that they shouldn't mess around with that woman. He looked at him questioningly, and Ryu continued to say that it seemed like she was simply the ring's mistress, but in reality, she was the most important person in the village. As long as they were here, they would constantly run into her. Did he understand that? Gino replied that he thought she was just an old fox who loved money. Ryu confirmed that this was true. That's exactly it. She was an old fox. She just wanted to profit from him. He had experienced the same thing in the fighting world. As soon as he showed results, hundreds of managers came to him too. Almost all of them saw him as just a way to make money. Charlatans easily deceived him. After all, he was just a project with a child who came to the big city to pursue a dream. Meeting his current manager was pure luck. It was he who made him a champion. He wondered how his coach was doing there. Thanks to him, he stopped being a loser. Everyone was fooling and became someone who gradually rose to the top, becoming a champion. And with this old fox, they'll see who's better. After a while, the waiter brought them their portion of meat. Ryu was delighted that it was very decent beef. The cook cut it into large pieces, and Gino asked Ryu to stop. He, who had already taken a piece of meat, asked again, "What?" Gino replied that it was fake, and the marbling was too different. Ryu shouted, "What fake?" He didn't even know what marbling was. He said it was somehow strange that it took a week to get this beef. If the beef could have been taken from a nearby village, they wouldn't have waited so long for it while in prison. And people say it's very valuable. It can't be that they give it away to all the visitors here. He thinks it's a different kind of beef, just a rank lower, but much less rare and cheaper too. Ryu replied, "Is that so? But whatever kind of beef it is, his stomach doesn't care, does it? He's very hungry now. He's upset about paying for Virtus and beef, and he doesn't even want to eat fake food. They're practically broke, and they have every right to catch them out." He raised his hand and apologized to the waiter. He approached him and asked, "Have they finished eating and want to pay?" When he got closer, he realized they were taking a long time to eat one portion. Jinho replied that it was fake. He'd ordered Verdes and beef, hadn't he? He offered to bring his order first. The waiter was irritated by the protagonist's gaze alone. He asked again, "Does he even know where he is?" This is no ordinary Yuri. Gino told him to stop and call the manager right away. The waiter asked again, "Have you completely lost your nerve, kid?" Gino replied, "Maybe the kid should tell everyone about this." At that moment, the surrounding patrons began to notice the altercation and turned to eavesdrop. The waiter realized this and asked him to shut up and follow him. A moment later, he brought them in and reported it to the manager. The manager sat surrounded by his subordinates, all holding sharp weapons. He asked if they were the scandalous guests. Jinho replied that he was one himself and that he sold counterfeit goods. The manager laughed and shouted that he was good, but he should know how to read the atmosphere. He didn't know what the atmosphere was, but he was the one who couldn't read the situation. Who should he kill first? When Jinho asked this question, the manager became angry and shouted that he deserved a lesson in life. And at that moment, his subordinates pounced on Jinho with fists and axes. Jinho easily defeated his opponents one after another. Fighting with incredible agility and speed, he eliminated each one individually. and when he managed to defeat all the guards, the director was stunned by the situation he was in. He was terrified when he saw the guards lying motionless on the ground. He screamed, "What's going on here?" Chino stood silently, looking him in the eye. Ryu was glad he dealt with those idiots so well. Did the director even know who he was? He was the one who knocked down. The director remembered hearing a story about some homeless guy defeating Ikas. Could that be true? And what did he want from him? Jinho replied that now he had to listen to him. He wanted proper compensation, everything within reason. He had two conditions. First, to return their money, and second, he would pay for the meat they ate here at the price of Erdison beef. Of course, did he understand? The director was dumbfounded by what he heard and didn't know what to do. Had they completely lost their nerve? Sometime later, evening arrived. Ryu and Jinho arrived at a hotel with a comfortable bed. Ryu was delighted to lie down on the bed and said it was the first time he'd slept on such a soft bed. It was so wonderful. He turned to Jinho and said it was incredible and that he was an aristocrat. He knew consumer rights. Jinho lay down on the next bed and said that if word spread, the restaurant would be ruined. For those without a countercoin, negotiations are pure hell. Ryu realized he'd never seen anyone so red-faced and thanked his friend for everything he'd done. Jino replied, "Enough talk. It's time to sleep." When it was deep into the night, Ryu couldn't sleep and opened his eyes, staring at the wall. Suddenly, he rose and whispered his name to Jinho and asked if he was asleep. Jino had his back to him and didn't answer. Ryu rose to his feet, wrapped his scarf around his neck, and headed for the exit. Jino heard all this and watched everything unfold. A few days later, Ryu entered the room and said, "Joe, he is hungry. When would they eat?" He was training right on the floor, and Ryu remarked that all he did was exercise. Magic, after all, hates exercise more than death. Was he training because he had no mana? Jino replied. That was more or less the case. Ryu was surprised and asked, "What's going on?" Jino opened the system window at that moment and realized that his magic wasn't increasing. No matter how much he checked, nothing changed. He already felt like he was cursed. His magic was still at 0. Maybe it was taking so long because he was creating it out of nothing. That meant reaching a level of 1 was the most important thing, and then it would get easier. He hoped. Morning exercises were over, and he suggested they go eat. Ryu asked what they would eat today, potato salad or chicken stew. Jino said no, suggesting beef. Ryu was delighted and said finally. They hadn't been to a steakhouse for 3 days. The reason was simple. They wanted to avoid any more arguments. They'd already eaten 10 meals on the first day, so they had plenty of money. Jinho turned to Ryu and asked how many gold coins they had left. He replied, "Almost none. The prices here are pretty high." Jinho replied, "I see. He's been playing this game for 10 years, so you know the prices perfectly well. To spend 50 coins in 3 days, you'd have to throw it around wildly." Ryu seemed to think he was an aristocrat, but he didn't know a thing about money. What was he hiding? Or was he just greedy? Maybe he was betting. Jino decided to pretend he didn't notice him pocketing the money until it smelled like betrayal. But it couldn't go on forever, and he at least needed to know the reason. A moment later, one of the director's subordinates ran into his office and announced they had arrived. He asked again, "Really?" The restaurant owner is a director named John. His pride's stronger than iron plates, and it's suffering because of some guy. He frowned and asked if they had everything ready. A moment later, the table was set and several cold cuts were prepared. The guys invited them to the table, and the waiter bowed and said that the meat was prepared in abundance, so they should eat together. Ryu was surprised and asked how much it all cost. The waiter replied that if they needed anything, they should call him. Jinho wondered why they had suddenly become so helpful. Ryu suggested that maybe it was because they had changed clothes. Jinho seriously doubted it and realized that there were no killers among them, and inside everything was the same as last time. What were they planning? At that moment, Ryu turned to Jinho and asked if he was hungry. He wants to give him a special salad. Let him eat it. His whole mind. Jinho replied, "Thank you." All he can do is observe the situation. He picked up the salad and decided that maybe with time he'd figure out what they were up to. When suddenly he froze and yelled at Ryu to spit out everything he'd just eaten. He realized this meat was inedible and Ryu screamed in fear. He started vomiting into a bucket, saying that if there was poison in it, he'd die now. Jinho replied, "No, a small amount won't do any harm." He suspected they were up to something, but was poisoning the meat too much. If he didn't have this ability, they would have simply been killed. The system informed him that his ability was steadfastness, and it counteracted frog poison. It wasn't for nothing he'd worked to acquire it. How many times had they already come close to death? Steadfastness can be obtained by consuming all known poisons and antidotes. Ryu replied that it had no taste or smell. Was it really poisoned? How could he be so sure? He replied that he was a mage. Ryu said in a trembling voice that he was an elite person and knew exactly when something was wrong. But what should they do now if they were trying to kill them? Shouldn't they run away? He lay down on the table and said he had no strength left. Gino asked again why. Ryu was surprised and asked again what. Joe replied that they should pay in full for it. Then he smiled and looked into the distance. When Jinf entered the hall, he asked if they had come and should just sit and eat their meat. Why were they calling him here? Jinho grinned and said he wanted to clear up a misunderstanding and ask something. Their plates were empty, and Jan thought, glutton. From that amount of frog poison, they were about to die. Jan blurted out, what misunderstanding could there possibly be? They're bandits blackmailing him out of his money. Joe asked again, does he see? He couldn't understand them at all. He invited him to sit down and talk over a piece of meat. Ryu handed him the remaining package of meat and offered it to him to eat. Jan got scared and screamed. Why is he shoving this at him? He replied that it was necessary to maintain conversation. If he listened to them, they would cancel their previous terms because they weren't bandits. He screamed enough. He had nothing to talk about. Shinho asked, how strange is that? Does he want to keep giving them money? Or is there a reason he doesn't want to eat? Maybe the meat was poisoned. Jay was dumbfounded by what he heard and screamed. What nonsense? He asked again. Is he surprised they understood everything? At that moment, Jinho flipped the table over in anger, smashing the dishes, and then pointed to the untouched hidden meat on the floor. JF was dumbfounded, not knowing what was happening, and shouted, what is he doing? All the meat was on the floor. They just threw it away. Did they really guess about the poison? That simply couldn't be. Jinho replied that they felt sorry for him and didn't come here, and yet he turned out to be such a scoundrel. He dared to poison the meat. Janth decided to pretend not to because there was no way they would actually guess. He shouted that there was no poison there. Do they have proof? He wanted to ask them about it. He started punching the wall, and Jinho asked again, proof, yes, he has it. He looked at him with his eyes, which had turned bright red, and said this. Jan realized that he had red eyes and was a mage. Jinho asked again, had he really dared to see the Arahan? The price would be his life. Jan fell to the ground, shaking with fear, muttering no. He said that if he alone disappeared, no one would even notice. Jan realized he was going to die and fell to his knees, then begging for forgiveness. Even though he didn't recognize him, he begged for mercy and for forgiveness just this once. He couldn't understand how an Arhan from the west had ended up on the southern outskirts, and why he hadn't made himself known right away. And why was he dressed in rags? Fearful, Chief John couldn't wait to hear any of these questions. He begged him to spare this brainless, despicable man just once. And if they spared him, he would do everything as needed. And Jinho, looking at his crocodile tears, fully realized how powerful the Arahan family was. It truly was a powerful trump card, and it was worth using sometimes, he asked. So, will he do everything as he says? Then perhaps he'll forgive him just this once. Jade bowed at his feet and shouted, thanks. He'll never forget this generosity. Jinho replied, firstly, that he must never reveal his identity to anyone. Jam shouted, of course, until the day the last nail is driven into his coffin. No, even after he's in the next world, he won't utter a word. Gino asked, secondly, to give him half of his property, and he'll forget what happened today. Jay was dumbfounded by this offer and shouted that he understood everything. He could give him everything right now, but he'd just have to wait a little. He was sincerely touched by the magician's generosity. After all, it was better to be penniless than dead, and the man was only asking for half. He needed to bring it quickly before he changed his mind. Jay ran to his office and looked at it questioningly before knocking. Meanwhile, Jinho was lost in thought, and Ryu smiled and said he was a good man. He couldn't even squeak. Jinho replied that as soon as they received the money, they would immediately leave this village. Ryu confirmed that this was excellent. But at that moment, Herna entered the hall and asked where they were going in such a hurry. They turned to her in surprise, and she greeted them again. Herna asked if they were really leaving again. She grinned and wondered if he was a much greater man than she thought. Jinho wondered if she really knew that he was Arahan. Had he exposed him in such a short time, it was unlikely given that he was genuinely scared. So, there was only one place she could find out about him. If she told Jamf about this, that all he had from Arahan was his last name, then they would never see the money and he needed to change places quickly. He suggested they talk privately, and she grinned and replied, okay. When she sat down at their table, Gino asked why she had come. She wanted something from him. She assumed he seemed to have misunderstood her. She had business with him, but she had come here to meet a client. He turned to Ryu and asked, with a client? He had done this. Ryu looked down and apologized as he shouldn't have hidden it. Herna found out what he had asked her for, but she would have to pay more for it. Ryu was dumbfounded and shouted that this was what they had agreed upon. After all, he had paid so much. She replied that this money wouldn't even be enough for a day. Did he really think it was that easy to look for a missing relative? It was hard for her to find out his whereabouts when he didn't even know if he was alive. Ryu screamed with tears in his eyes. How could this be? This was his last hope. Jinho seemed to understand what was going on and asked them to stop, suggesting the following. She had said he had business with him, hadn't she? Then he suggested tying it in with the current problem. Herna asked if he was offering to do business with her in exchange for helping him. That was great. Then her conditions were simple. He has to fight Ika's one more time, and that's it. Ryu asked Jinho not to, but he said, okay, he'll accept the second fight. Then will she continue with Ryu's assignment? She responded, licking her lips. Naturally, she always keeps her promises. Sometime later, evening arrived and the guys headed home. Ryu looked at the chest and remained silent. Jinho turned around and asked why he was so sad. They had earned so much money after all. He silently looked at the floor and apologized. He didn't want to deceive him. Joe replied that he knew about it, and Ryu continued to say that he hadn't told her and that he had gone from him to her and understood that it was stupid, but he had no other choice. Jaina replied that he knew everything and that he had taken the money, too. Ryu asked again, did he know? Jaina replied, yes, but he had only just found out today that he had approached Hera specifically. Ryu asked again, then why had he pretended not to know anything? He replied that he didn't feel sorry for the money. This was equivalent to the help he'd given him. Ryu watched him go in surprise, and Jino turned around and begged him not to let this happen again, and that he shouldn't hide anything from him from now on. The most vile thing you could do is sell someone else's trust. No matter where he came from, let him not become trash. Ryu tearfully looked at the chest and swore his loyalty, then turned to Jinho and told them not to fight again, suggesting they simply run away with the money as they had wanted. Jino asked again, what will happen to his relatives? Ryu replied that he knew for sure that this woman would back away again and not keep her promise. Ryu wasn't foolish enough to fall for Hera's tricks a second time, but he was so desperate that he turned to her. He clutched at the now broken rope, and Herna took advantage of the desperate boy. Gino replied that he knew everything and had initially considered leaving, but had now changed his mind. Ryu asked again, why was he really going to fight? He certainly believed in his skills, but she was definitely up to something. Jinho replied that this made him want to fight even more. Looking at trash always made him want to clean it up. Ryu yelled in surprise. What do you mean? Jinho replied that it was so cool to defeat an opponent who had put everything into the fight. Meanwhile, in the carry-on fortress, the guards were scurrying back and forth. When one of them approached the general, he announced that they were ready to capture him. Clark replied that that was excellent. Let the first group leave already. He grew angry and releasing his dark mana said, those little rats were hiding right under his nose. This time he would definitely finish him off. At that moment, he shouted his name and clenched his teeth in anger. 3 days later, the protagonist found himself back in the arena. He didn't understand why he was still alive. He just hit him so hard. Something was wrong here. Ryu, watching from the sidelines, asked if he sensed danger. Maybe they should call off the fight. Then Go considered this, and at that moment, and the homeless man had their rematch. It's starting now. When the host announced this, those around him were dumbfounded and shouted. Ryu also noticed something was wrong, and they shouted that he was copying his technique. Ikaz wondered if Herna must have given him some advice. Maybe she said he was a mage without mana. He thought it was true that he was thrown into a concentration camp. He needed to check it out. At that moment, he rushed at his opponent, and Jinho was surprised by such a sudden movement. He decided to thrust his fist straight from his chest, applying maximum force. Ikaz grinned and suddenly shouted. He thought he was the only one who could do this. He had practiced, and it had proven effective. Jino was a little surprised and began to brush off his blows, when he suddenly saw the belt on him and realized what it was. He hit his opponent, and he stepped back a little. Smoke was coming from both of them. AKAs asked, so it's true then? He was an idiot without mana. It didn't hurt him at all. Jino wondered if this was really happening. The people around him started shouting. Since when had I become so resilient? There he was the strongest. Jino was sure he was wearing the ogre belt. It was an artifact that increased physical damage by 90%. Since his magic stat was at 0, it was the worst weapon against him right now. That was why he was being so pompous. But how was that possible? Ryu was worried that none of his friend Zed's attacks had gotten through. He shouted, Zed, that woman definitely did something. This fight is really dangerous. Jinho approached Ryu and asked him to calm down because everything was fine. He smiled and calmly looked at his opponent. Ryu looked at him questioningly, not understanding why he was smiling. Akaz asked, well, is he giving up? Jinho replied, never, but he was genuinely surprised. At that moment, he assumed a certain position, and Ikaz realized his stance had changed. Jinho replied that this was the moment he had been waiting for. Why would he give up now? AKAs wondered if he should stand up like that too. But before he could fully consider the thought, Jinho pounced on him and kicked him in the face with such force that he lost his balance and began to fall. He kicked him in the chest again, and I collapsed completely. Jinho smiled and realized that the strongest man on earth, Jinho, was incredibly happy at that very moment. No one could stand against him for more than a minute. Because of this, he couldn't test the techniques he had spent so long perfecting. Let them all look at him. He was covered in blood, but he was still standing. Zet, or Jinho, this was the first time he had ever seen such a thing. He decided to pounce on his opponent again and used an overhead kick. Didn't understand what was happening and tried to defend himself. But at that moment, Jinho's foot came from a completely different direction, then hit him in the chest again. He was dumbfounded by the pain and screamed, then began to fall. He realized he'd lost again and cursed, unable to even predict his punches, much less block them. What was going on? Jinho screamed at him not to even think about falling. Was it hurting anymore? A moment later, he shouted, "Enough." He gives up, but Jinho didn't even let him finish and kneed him in the jaw. After a while, everyone in the hall was stunned by the sight. Jinho attacked Ekis again in the side and broke the special belt on his pants. His belt was shattered and he fell to his knees. Jinho, coming closer, asked him, what happened? Was he really not getting up? He didn't answer, only thinking that he was now fighting a crazy freak. Iko screamed that he had lost and no longer had the belt. Referee, please stop this fight. But at that moment, Jinho kicked him in the face again and said, no, it's not enough for him yet. He would be disappointed to end it like this. Was terrified when he looked into his opponent's eyes and suddenly saw red. Gino's eyes turned completely red and his opponent froze in terror and trembled, then rolled back in his head and lost consciousness. Gino asked, is he unconscious? At that moment, a magical blue light began to glow from his chest. He realized it was an unfamiliar feeling, like worms being detected in his body. A system window appeared in front of Jinho, and Jinho realized that finally the magic boost had increased to 1. It was as if endorphins were flooding him. This was even better than he thought. He rejoiced, clenching his fist and realizing that there was no way there wasn't magic, even if he had used a trick to bypass the system. By the way, why was it so quiet? He turned around and found the audience silent. Perplexed, Ryu ran up to him and shouted, why did he take off his contacts? He asked again what, but he hadn't taken them off. At that moment, he realized that his iris was now red. Ryu screamed, yes, that's what he was talking about. Jinho realized he hadn't felt the lenses fall out. Had they melted because of the mana? Ryu wondered if he'd simply not seen him without them in a long time. But the color of his eyes seemed to have deepened. At that moment, the people around him saw his red eyes and became frightened. They shouted that he was Arahan, that his eyes were definitely red. Everyone should run from here, and if they made eye contact with him, they would die. People began to flee the room in a hurry and fear, and Jinho realized things were bad. They might send guards after them. They had to run now. Ryu screamed back that he'd go crazy and that he'd told him he should have run away right away. Jinho turned to Herna and shouted that he would find her, so let her look for Ryu and LT, Unk and GT, as relative. She realized she should have listened to the general. They were such puppies. She'll tear him apart. Zadafan. She rose with such anger and went into action. After a while, she wondered how much money she'd lost. Ikaz was a high-class fighter and brought in a huge amount of money. Over 3 years, he'd earned 600 gold coins, but now he was no longer marketable. She'd given 200 gold coin for the belt and 1,200 to the general, so her damages amounted to 2,000 gold coins. She was so angry and shouted loudly that she should have listened to the general right away. Her hard-earned 2,000 were gone. This damn brat had created this situation, and she was ready to tear him apart right now. They quickly ran for the lenses and money, but when they got out, the village was already overrun with guards. Jinho whispered to Ryu that this wouldn't work and that they needed to hide. After a while, night fell and they hid again in the crate and barrel. When Ryu looked outside, he asked, I think they've already left. He stood up and suggested that his friend wait there as he would try to find them card. At that moment, a young man passed by and the boys were dumbfounded when they saw his gaze. The man said that Lady Herna had sent him and said that she needed to deliver something to them, so he should bring them to her and no one would give them cart now. Anyway, after some time, they actually got into the cart, and Ryu asked if everything would be okay. He answered, no, it was obviously a trap. They had all gathered somewhere remote and were waiting for them. Ryu asked, then why did they get here? Jinho replied that they would have to solve this problem eventually, and they had no choice. Ryu realized that this time they would definitely die and said this in a trembling voice. Sometime later, when they found themselves in that very trap, Herna was surrounded by many guards and Commander-in-Chief Clark. They were armed, and Clark said that they had dodged. Ryu asked what they should do now. Jinho didn't respond, and Clark said that they dared steal the keys and run away. That's what only rats do, not mages. Perna, grinning, peered over his shoulder and muttered how sad it was, and that if they cooperated with her from the start, none of this would have happened. He realized this old fox was now telling him no news. Even if he rewinded time now, he wouldn't act differently. They still couldn't kill him. Clark grew angry and shouted, Zed Arahan, he'll end him right here and now. Let no one interfere. Jinho asked Ryu to step back, and he agreed, backing away. When Clark approached and stood in front of Jinho, he asked if he was going to fight him. He turned out to be nicer than the average mage. Jinho replied that his chances of winning were 50%, a 50% chance. When facing a strong opponent, you shouldn't belittle yourself. And when facing a weak one, you should be careless. Even though he is a knight of the fifth circle, he doesn't have to fear 50 to 50 chances. Clark drew his sword and declared that he was still as brazen as ever. And that was excellent because he would immediately release all his energy. At that moment, he used all his strength and a magical aura glowed around him. He tensed, and at that moment, Clark swung his sword at him and shouted for him to die. As he approached him with incredible speed, Jinho was stunned and realized that this was exactly what he wanted. He didn't need much, just to feel those long-forgotten feelings. And in that moment, he felt like Jinho, and he became a fighter again. The system reported that the natural-born fighter feature had been applied. All stats were temporarily increased by 10. His eyes glowed red, and a magical wave formed between them that exploded immediately. All the guys covered their eyes from the bright flash and explosion, and Ryu screamed in fear. Jinho Clark stood in disbelief as the dust cleared. When he looked ahead, he realized he was nowhere to be found. A huge depression formed in the ground, and Jinho shouted to Clark that he was already above. Clark realized he was in danger upon hearing his voice and realized that the glow represented Thunder Aura. Jinho cast this spell and glowed with magical flashes. The system reported that this was its final form. Clark couldn't understand how he had managed to do this. Jinho's hair stood on end with his energy, and he confidently looked into the eyes of the general, who fearfully tried to defend himself with his sword. But Jinho struck him and continued to press on the sword. Clark found it difficult to parry this attack. He held on with all his might, but still retreated. He didn't understand. How is this possible? He was speechless. Was this really Thunder Aura? Thunder Aura is a special energy that ignores the basic elements of water, air, earth, and fire. It is admired by all mages, an energy that even the founder of the legendary Aaron clan could not master. This little fellow had mastered legendary power. All the surrounding guards recognized his power and were dumbfounded, as was Hera, who was unable to move. Everyone watched Jinho glow, and Ryu was also amazed. He addressed him by name, and Jinho realized that this was the very power of his blood, something he had always lacked. Clark shouted that he despised those who rely solely on the strength of their genes above all else. At that moment, he struck Jinho with a bright beam of light, but he deftly dodged it, leaving Clark perplexed. Jinho looked at him confidently and continued to evade all attacks Clark attempted, but eventually he grew tired and paused. At that moment, Jinho realized another blow was coming, one he couldn't avoid. When the blade touched his body, Clark realized he had used a shield. He looked ahead questioningly, and Jinho was already at his side, striking him square in the stomach. Clark flew into the air and began screaming in pain and terror. Jinho looked him in the eye confidently and continued attacking. A moment later, several more bright flashes of light and explosions occurred. Their magic clashed again. Clark was terrified and screamed from exhaustion. Jinho paused, then extended his palm toward his opponent, and his thunderous aura lit him up. Clark didn't understand what was happening. He was supposed to be a mage, so why was he punching him? Magic uses its power to prevent knights from breaking through, and knights try to counter with magic and attack. These are the historically established rules of the world. No one has ever broken them before, and that was how it was before. But Jinho changed everything. At that moment, Jinho's aura shifted toward Clark, and he too was illuminated by bright magical beams. He realized he wouldn't be treated like the other mages, and he grew angry. He needed to get away to use his sword. When Clark backed away, Jinho suddenly appeared next to him again, and Clark realized the danger of the situation. Jinho struck him again, leaving him no room. This made Clark curse and realize he was in dire straits. Jinho swung his fist at him again, hitting him in the chest so hard that Clark screamed in pain and horror. A bright wave of light spread throughout the area, and the general was thrown far to the side, destroying some of the ground. When he managed to stop, he coughed up blood, and the guard screamed, "General!" Clark yelled at them not to approach him. He grew angry and frowned, then began to laugh. He kept saying that the Arahan were an amazing family. He lost. Let him kill him. Gino asked if he wanted him to tell him why he lost. Clark said he didn't want to hear it. Let him just kill him. Gino replied that there was only one reason. He tried and prepared more than him. Clark was dumbfounded at that moment, and Jinho smirked at him. Clark asked again, did he try and prepare? Let him talk such nonsense. It was all because he was born from the Aaron family, different from birth. He asked again, how could he know that? Or were they ordinary people going through? People like him had ruined his life. Juo silently looked at him and said that he was weaker now, and if he had applied his accumulated experience, he would have definitely lost. His feelings of inferiority had clouded his vision, so he was stuck. He shouldn't look for the reason for his defeat elsewhere. It lay only within himself. Clark remarked that it was funny, and the young mage reminded him of his long-forgotten, chivalrous spirit. He said enough and let him kill him right now. Jinho considered the danger, as killing the man would put him on the wanted list throughout the Empire, so he couldn't simply leave. The system reported that the natural-born fighter trait had been cancelled and the ultimate form skill had been disabled. Jinho looked at his hands and realized that seemed to be it. At that moment, a loud cry rang out asking why they were just standing there. They had to go and kill this mage right now. That was their job. After Herna shouted at them to kill him, the guards froze and turned to look at her. They didn't know what to do. Jinho realized that so many guards around him was a bit dangerous. He turned and looked at them questioningly, and suddenly a strong wind began to blow. They began to wonder where the sudden wind was coming from. He froze and realized it was someone's magic. There was definitely a mage nearby, and things were bad. But where was their opponent? At that moment, he realized he needed to dodge quickly. Suddenly, the storm began to subside, and Jinho realized everything. He saw the guards in front of him, destroyed and unconscious, lying in pools of their own blood. This frightened him greatly, and he asked, what is this? Everyone died in an instant without making a sound, even Herna. But then, did this someone help him? When he turned around, he saw that Clark had also died, and he realized that he would have to take the blame for all this. When he started to turn around, he asked Ryu, is he alive? Where is he? Let him answer him right now. Ryu, who emerged from the bushes, called his name and Jinho, and this pleased him. When Ryu ran out, he asked, what is this? Zed, what did he do? Gino answered, no, it seems there is a powerful mage around here somewhere. He needed to get out of here quickly. At that moment, Ryu asked him to wait and look here. A card appeared here from somewhere. He picked it up from the ground and said it was clean, as if it had just been dropped. Isn't that strange? It turned out the mage was watching him from behind a tree. He donned a cloak and a bandage over his face to avoid detection. After a while, night fell and the men lit a fire in the forest to rest. Jinho observed the card and realized it was completely blank. But if he used a little mana, he knew it was magical. When he used the mana, a symbol appeared on the card, and that symbol was the Black Flame of Arahan. The warriors of the Black Arahan clan are loyal only to the head of the Arahan family, and their numbers are completely secret. It is the largest secret organization in the Empire. Number 4, if his memory serves him correctly, is 1 is acceptance or support. 2 is rejection or denial. 3 is deals or proposals. And A4 is observation or protection. Could the mages really be protecting him? So when he had no magic, he was kicked out, and now everything is different. He remembered his magic stat and uncovered the system. After the battle with the guest, some of the penalties were removed and magic increased by 2. So, in this world, experience is gained the same way as in the game. The ultimate form skill greatly increases physical strength and raises it, but now it's disabled apparently due to a staff shortage. So, to activate it, they need 5 magic points or 10. Ryu addressed his friend by name, and Jinho asked again, is he awake? Ryu confirmed that he couldn't sleep and asked what they should do now. He replied, something like that. They have to go. They got lost there, right? Ryu replied that he had already said there was no coachman's body, and by now rumors should be spreading, and then he would be put on a wanted list throughout the Empire. They wouldn't reach the city without a carriage, and it's a very long way to walk. Gino replied, speaking of which, they need to change their route slightly. He went crazy and said they would go to Tamaya. It's a village, a southern frontline outpost. When they arrived at the fortress, a magical seal appeared before them. Inside this magical seal was Torres, who was spreading this magic everywhere. He was followed by several knights on horseback. They decided to set out directly to search. When Torres looked into the distance, he said his name and that he would find the dishonest Arahan and punish him. After a while, Torres knelt down and asked he summoned him. Master Fernando sat on the throne before him and said yes, he had a matter. Several years ago, and Arahan was exiled to Carrion, but he had recently escaped, killing several guards and residents of the nearest town. He entrusted everything to him. He was the heir of Bahal, so he must manage everything himself. He needed to protect the family's honor. He looked up at him and replied, "Yes." He tore as Bahal swears on his life that he will carry